The night was colder than usual for mid-April. The wind howled through the narrow alleyways, carrying with it the scent of rain and distant car exhaust. Inside the small, dimly lit apartment, 28-year-old David Garcia sat on his couch, staring at the TV, but not really watching it. His mind kept drifting back to that afternoon. Earlier, David had met up with his old friend Luke to settle an old score. What was supposed to be a casual meetup turned into a heated argument. They had known each other since high school, but their relationship had soured over the years. Luke had betrayed David in ways that cut deep, and that afternoon, David had finally had enough. Words were exchanged, fists were thrown, and by the end of it, David found himself with blood on his hands. As the adrenaline slowly faded, David realized what he had done. Luke was dead. He had taken the life of someone he had once called a friend. The weight of that reality settled heavily on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. What had started as a simple confrontation had ended in tragedy. He had never meant for things to go so far. David didn't know what to do. The only thing he could think of was to leave the scene quickly. He wiped his hands on his clothes and grabbed his car keys. He had to get away. He wasn't thinking straight, but he couldn't face the consequences right then. The sirens, the flashing lights, the police questioning. He couldn't deal with any of that. Not yet. The next few hours were a blur. David drove aimlessly around the city, trying to clear his mind, but the image of Luke's lifeless body kept haunting him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Luke's face, the expression of shock, of betrayal. David had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Back in his apartment, David tried to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. His mind raced. What if the police came knocking? What if they found out? He had no alibi, no way of proving he was innocent. The guilt gnawed at him, gnawed like a rat chewing through his bones. The only thing he had going for him was that no one knew he was there that night, right? No one saw him do it, or so he thought. The next morning, David was jolted awake by the shrill sound of his phone ringing. It was a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment, then answered it. Hello? His voice was hoarse, the remnants of a sleepless night evident in every syllable. David Garcia? A stern voice on the other end spoke his name, sending a chill down his spine. Yeah? Who's this? David's heart raced. Had someone figured it out? This is Detective Harris with the Riverside Police Department. I need you to come down to the station. We need to speak with you about an incident that occurred last night. David's blood ran cold. The room seemed to spin as the reality of the situation sank in. They knew? How? How could they know? I don't know what you're talking about, David said, his voice shaky, his breath quickening. We have footage from a security camera that puts you at the scene of a crime last night, the detective replied, his tone no nonsense. I suggest you come down now and cooperate. The line went dead before David could respond. His mind raced, and his thoughts scattered like leaves in a windstorm. Footage? What footage? There was no way they could have recorded what happened, right? He had been so careful, so sure that he had covered his tracks. But what if he hadn't? David felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He looked around the small apartment as if the walls themselves might offer some answers, but nothing came to mind. All he could hear was the ringing in his ears, louder than the beating of his heart. He was trapped. David arrived at the police station an hour later, his mind racing with anxiety. The detective had insisted that he come in, but now that he was here, he wished he could disappear. As he walked through the sterile, bright hallways of the station, he felt the walls closing in around him. He had made a terrible mistake, and now the truth was catching up with him. Detective Harris greeted him at the door to the interrogation room. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense attitude, Harris didn't waste time with pleasantries. David, sit down, he said, pointing to the cold metal chair across from him. David obeyed, his palms sweating as he sat down. He could feel the tension in the room thickening, as if the air itself were charged with the promise of a storm. Do you know why you're here, David? Harris asked, his voice calm but firm. David swallowed hard. He had no idea how to respond. He wanted to lie, to deny everything, but something in Harris's eyes made him hesitate. The detective knew more than he was letting on. David could feel it. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't do anything wrong." Harris didn't flinch. "You were seen at the scene of a crime, David, and we have security footage that shows you leaving the building last night. You were with Luke Jackson, weren't you?" The name hit David like a slap to the face. Luke. His heart skipped a beat. He couldn't breathe for a moment. How could they possibly know that? He had been so careful. "Luke, I didn't mean to hurt him. It happened so fast. We fought, and then—" David's voice broke, his guilt bubbling to the surface. "Tell me what happened, David," Harris said, his voice lowering to a more sympathetic tone. "We know you and Luke had problems, but it doesn't explain why he's dead now. It doesn't explain why you were seen leaving his apartment." David clenched his fists in his lap, trying to steady himself. He was on the verge of breaking, but he wasn't ready to confess yet. Not like this. "I didn't mean to do it," he said, his voice shaking. "It was just an argument. Things got heated, and then I lost control." He looked up at Harris, his eyes wide. "You have to believe me. I didn't plan it." Harris studied him for a moment. "I'm not here to judge, David. I'm here to understand what happened. But the footage we have is pretty damning. You were seen leaving the scene with something in your hand, and we've got the timestamp. You left around 11:15 p.m., just minutes after Luke was killed." David's mind spun as the detective spoke. He had no idea what the police had. He had no idea how far their investigation had gone. He could feel the walls closing in, the pressure building. I didn't take anything from him," David stammered. "I didn't steal anything." "We know that, David," Harris said. "But you were carrying something, and we need to know what it was." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "If you tell us the truth now, it could help you. But if you keep lying, it's only going to make things worse for you." David's mind raced. His head felt heavy. He had no choice. The truth would come out eventually, wouldn't it? But how much had the police already figured out? How much did they know? I was just angry," David whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to go so far. But when I saw Luke lying there, I panicked. I thought I had to cover my tracks." Harris gave him a long, hard look, then nodded slowly. "That's a start, David, but it's not enough." David's world was collapsing. As Detective Harris and his partner continued the interrogation, David's mind kept going back to the security footage. He couldn't escape the feeling that something bigger was at play here. They had footage. They had the evidence. But how much of it did they have? Hours passed in that small room. David's palms were slick with sweat, and his throat felt dry. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, a constant reminder of the time slipping away from him. Finally, Harris returned with a stack of papers in his hand. "We've reviewed the footage, David," he said, his voice calm but stern. "We know you were there, and we know you left with something. We also know you took Luke's phone, and that's where things get interesting." David's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "We've tracked the phone, David, and it's not just about the footage. The phone was used to send a message after Luke's death, a message that made it look like Luke was still alive. And that's a problem, don't you think?" David stared at the detective, the reality of the situation sinking in. He thought he could hide his tracks, but the phone, the footage, it was all coming together. Everything he had done to cover his crime was unraveling before his eyes. The detective's words hit David harder than any punch ever could. The phone, the message. David had been so focused on the physical evidence, so determined to cover his tracks, that he never once considered what could be lurking in the digital world. The moment he had taken Luke's phone, he had unknowingly opened a Pandora's box. I didn't send that message," David whispered, his voice breaking. His mind scrambled for any rational explanation, but there was none. The truth was staring him in the face, and there was no way to escape it. Harris leaned forward, his gaze steady. "We know you didn't, but you took the phone, didn't you? And then what?" Did you think you could just wipe it clean and walk away?" David clenched his fists, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened in those few minutes of panic after the crime. He had grabbed Luke's phone as he left the scene, not thinking about the consequences. It wasn't about stealing it. It was about covering his tracks. He had planned to destroy the phone to make sure there was nothing left that could tie him to the crime. But in his haste, he had made a fatal mistake. "We've found the message you sent, David," Harris continued, his voice softening but still carrying an undeniable authority. "It was sent from Luke's phone to a number in your contacts. You made it look like Luke had texted you. It was a lie, a deliberate attempt to mislead us. You made sure that if we found Luke's phone, it wouldn't look suspicious." David's chest tightened. The room felt smaller. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, and every word the detective spoke seemed to make the walls close in just a little bit more. "I didn't mean to," David started, but his voice faltered. The guilt was overwhelming. He had tried to cover up a murder, tried to erase the evidence, but he had only made it worse. "I get it, David," Harris said, leaning back in his chair. "You were scared. You panicked. But trying to manipulate the evidence, trying to deceive the people who could help you, that's what got you into even deeper trouble." David could barely keep his eyes open. It was as if the weight of the entire world had landed on his shoulders. He had thought that lying and covering up the truth was his only way out. But now he understood. The more he tried to hide, the more his actions came to light. He had been trapped from the very beginning. "Luke." "He didn't deserve this," David whispered. The words felt hollow, empty. They did nothing to undo what had been done. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just snapped. I couldn't control myself." Harris nodded slowly. "I know. We've all had moments where anger took control, but that doesn't mean you can take someone's life and just walk away from it." David's heart pounded in his chest. The realization that there was no way out, no easy escape from the consequences of his actions, was finally sinking in. He had thought he could outrun the truth, but now it was right in front of him, unavoidable. As the interrogation continued, the detectives dug deeper, pushing David to reveal more details, to confess fully. Each question felt like a hammer driving the final nail into his coffin. There was no room for denial, no chance to run anymore. Hours seemed to pass in a blur. The more David talked, the more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. He hadn't just killed Luke in a fit of rage. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. He had been planning this in his mind for a long time, and the final confrontation had merely been the spark that lit the flame. By the time the interview ended, David was a shell of the man who had walked into the station hours earlier. The man who had entered the room with his head held high, convinced that he could outsmart everyone, had crumbled. The pressure had been too much. He had confessed, admitted everything, but in doing so, he had realized something even darker about himself. David had killed Luke, but it wasn't just a crime of passion. It had been a long, drawn-out unraveling, a series of choices that had led him to this point. Luke's betrayal had been the tipping point, but the resentment had been building for years. David hadn't been able to control his anger, and now that anger had destroyed everything he had once known. The detective finally gave David a moment to collect himself, and the reality of the situation hit him like a wave. He wasn't just a man who had committed murder, he was a man who had lost everything. There was no going back from this, no fixing it. His life, as he knew it, was over. David sat in the interrogation room alone, staring at the cold metal table in front of him. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound in the room. His mind was empty, devoid of any hope. What was left for him now? What could he say to anyone, to himself, after what he had done? As the door to the room opened, Detective Harris walked in, holding a folder in his hand. He sat down across from David, his expression unreadable. "We've got enough to charge you, David," Harris said flatly, "and we're going to. But I think you know that." David didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Harris continued, his voice calm, but tinged with a sense of finality. "You'll be arraigned tomorrow. You'll get a lawyer, and they'll do their best to defend you. But in the end, it doesn't change what happened, and nothing can undo the damage you've caused." David felt a sickening knot twist in his stomach. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions. No matter how much he wished to turn back time, he couldn't. The clock had run out. "Do you have any final words, David?" Harris asked, his voice quiet, as if he understood the magnitude of the moment. David's gaze remained fixed on the table. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? Nothing could bring Luke back. Nothing could undo the loss, the pain, the horror. All he had left was the overwhelming guilt and the cold realization that his life had just come to an end. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." David was escorted from the interrogation room in handcuffs. The weight of the metal against his wrists felt like a cruel reminder of the life he had destroyed, of the choices he had made that led him here. He was no longer free. He was no longer the man he had once been. As he was led down the sterile hallway to his holding cell, David couldn't stop thinking about Luke, his friend, his former friend. How could it have come to this? How had everything unraveled so quickly? The question would haunt him for the rest of his life. David was placed in a small, cold cell, alone with his thoughts. The door slammed shut behind him, and he collapsed onto the hard bench, his body exhausted from the emotional toll of the past hours. It was over. He had confessed, he had destroyed everything, and now he would have to pay the price. But as David sat there in the darkness, waiting for what would come next, one question remained at the forefront of his mind. How long would it take for him to truly face the consequence of what he had done? This concludes the next part of the story. Let me know if you'd like me to continue, or if you have any other specific requests. Days passed as David sat alone in his cell, the world outside continuing to spin while his life had come to a sudden, grinding halt. The air inside the prison was stale, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered with an unsettling hum. Each day felt like an eternity. He had tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't let him. His thoughts were tangled, a constant stream of guilt and regret. His trial was approaching, and David knew that it would only be a matter of time before the evidence against him was laid bare for the world to see. He had confessed. He had admitted to everything, but part of him still held onto a shred of hope, a desperate wish that maybe, just maybe, there was something, anything, that could change his fate. In the silence of his cell, he could hear the sounds of other inmates, some shouting in the distance, others banging on the walls. The place was filled with anger, frustration, and hopelessness, and it felt like a constant reminder of the life he had left behind. But even here, even in the depths of despair, David couldn't help but hold on to that small spark of hope. He didn't want to die in here, forgotten, with nothing but the weight of his actions to keep him company. His lawyer had come to visit him a few days ago, explaining the grim reality of his situation. The charges against him were serious: murder in the first degree, robbery, and tampering with evidence. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence, and David's confession only made their case stronger. The evidence was airtight, seemed like a done deal. But still, his lawyer promised to fight for a lighter sentence. Maybe there was a chance for him to get out on parole someday. Maybe he could redeem himself. It was a long shot, but it was all David had left to hold on to. His thoughts were interrupted when the door to his cell clanged open. He looked up, his heart skipping a beat. It was a guard. "Time for your meeting," the guard said gruffly, his voice devoid of emotion. David stood up, his legs weak from sitting for so long. He followed the guard down the narrow hallway, his mind racing. Was it his lawyer again? Or was it someone from the outside, someone who had come to tell him bad news, or perhaps even good news? David didn't know what to expect, and the uncertainty made his stomach churn. When they reached the small visiting room, David was told to sit down. He did, feeling the cold metal of the chair against his back. The door opened, and in walked a figure David didn't expect to see: his mother. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She walked toward him slowly, as if each step was a struggle. David's heart twisted in his chest. He had never wanted to see her like this. His mother had always been his rock, the one person who believed in him no matter what. And now, here she was, looking broken and defeated. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. She sat down across from him, her hands shaking as she clasped them together. "What happened? What did you do? Why did you do this?" David couldn't look at her. He stared at the table between them, the weight of her question hanging heavily in the air. He had no answers, no way to explain. How could he? There was no justification for what he had done. He had taken a life, and there was no way to undo it. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Mom," David finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for any of this to happen." His mother's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table, her hand trembling as it touched his. "I know you didn't mean to, David, but you still did it. And now everything's changed." David felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, to make it right. But there were no words that could erase the pain, no words that could undo the damage. His mother had always been there for him, and now he had destroyed everything she had ever known. "I don't know what to do," she continued, her voice breaking. "You've always been my son, my baby boy. And now, I don't know what to think anymore." David's heart shattered. He had always promised his mother that he would never let her down. But now, in this moment, he realized that he had done just that. Worse than that, he had destroyed her trust in him, and he would never be able to get that back. "I'm so sorry, Mom," David whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know what happened. It all went wrong, and I can't fix it." His mother squeezed his hand, her tears flowing freely now. "David, I don't know how to help you. I don't know what to say, but I'll always be here for you no matter what. You're my son. I love you." Her words hit David like a punch to the gut. It was the last thing he expected to hear from her. Despite everything, despite his actions, his mother was still offering him love and support, and it hurt more than anything else. He didn't deserve her love. He didn't deserve anything. "I love you too, Mom," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The guard reappeared at the door, signaling that visiting hours were over. David's mother stood up, her eyes never leaving his. "I'll be here when you need me, David. Just remember that." David watched as she walked away, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed in his mind. He was left alone once more in the cold, sterile room, the guilt and shame pressing down on him like a heavy weight. For the first time since the day of the murder, David allowed himself to feel the full weight of his actions. It wasn't just the crime. It wasn't just the life he had taken. It was everything. The relationships he had destroyed, the trust he had shattered, the person he had become. There was no escaping it. The days leading up to the trial were a blur. David was assigned a public defender, someone who seemed nice enough but didn't seem to offer much hope. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and even his lawyer admitted that it would be a tough case to win. David's mind was consumed with one thought. How could he live with himself after everything he had done? He had thought he could outrun the truth, could hide behind lies and deception, but the truth always found a way to catch up. And now, the consequences were inevitable. On the day of the trial, David was escorted into the courtroom in handcuffs, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the whispers of judgment, but it all felt distant, like he was watching from the outside. He didn't belong here, not like this, but this was his reality now. This was the life he had created for himself. As the trial began, David's world seemed to shrink. The judge, the prosecutor, the defense lawyer, they all seemed like distant figures. All he could focus on was the weight of their eyes on him, the judgment that was being passed, the fate that was about to be sealed. The prosecutor spoke first, laying out the case against David. They had the evidence. The confession, the blood, the phone records, the messages. It was clear what had happened. Luke was dead, and David was the one who had killed him. The defense lawyer spoke next, attempting to paint David as a man who had made a tragic mistake. He spoke of David's background, his upbringing, his apparent remorse. But David knew it wouldn't matter. Nothing could change the fact that he had taken a life. And then it was time for David to speak. His lawyer asked if he would like to say anything in his defense. David stood, his legs shaking, his throat dry. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for any of this to happen. But it did, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. I can't change what I did, but I can promise that I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air, but David knew they wouldn't change anything. He had taken a life. He had destroyed everything, and now he would face the consequences. David sat silently in the courtroom, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, every muscle in his body tense. The words from his confession had left his lips days ago, but the weight of them still clung to him like a suffocating blanket. He had been hoping for some miracle, something to stop the inevitable. But deep down, he knew there was no escaping what he had done. He had taken a life. He had ended something that could never be undone. The judge, an older man with gray hair and spectacles that seemed to pierce through David's very soul, stood up, signaling that the jury had reached its decision. David could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, the silent judgment from the people who had come to witness the trial. His mother, sitting in the back of the room, was there too, her face a mask of exhaustion and grief. The judge cleared his throat, and the room fell into a heavy silence. "We, the jury, find the defendant, David Monroe, guilty of first-degree murder." David's heart seemed to stop as the words rang in his ears. Guilty. The finality of it hit him with the force of a freight train. There was no turning back now. The weight of the sentence hung in the air, and all he could do was breathe in the cold, sharp air of reality. He had been found guilty. There would be no escape. His lawyer's hand was on his shoulder, offering a silent show of support. But David barely noticed. He could hear nothing except the sound of his own heartbeat, the drumbeat of doom echoing in his ears. The judge continued, his voice cold and professional, but David could hardly focus on the words anymore. "David Monroe, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." The words hit David like a thunderclap, shaking him to his core. Life without parole. His entire future, his entire existence, reduced to the confines of a prison cell. It felt like a death sentence, except one where he would have to live through every agonizing moment. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but he knew it would be futile. The truth was, this was his fate now. His mother's sobs echoed through the courtroom as the judge declared the court adjourned. David barely had the strength to turn and face her. He had caused all of this. He had ruined everything. She was there, the only person in the world who still loved him, and he couldn't even look her in the eye. He had let her down, and no amount of remorse could ever take that away. The days turned into weeks, as David was transported to the prison where he would spend the rest of his life. The reality of his sentence began to sink in, and the true weight of his crime settled heavily on his shoulders. The steel bars of the prison cell, the cold concrete floors, and the constant sounds of inmates shouting in the distance. It was all so overwhelming. It was a far cry from the world he once knew. He had imagined prison life in countless ways, but nothing could have prepared him for the absolute isolation he now faced. There were no visitors, no comforting voices to offer him hope. His mother had stopped writing after the first few weeks. It wasn't that she didn't love him, but how could she? How could anyone continue to love someone who had done what he had done? David's only company was the constant hum of the prison's machinery, the clanging of gates, the sounds of other inmates shouting in anger or frustration. There was no peace. There was no escape. And with every passing day, he felt the gnawing sense of regret become a part of him. His punishment wasn't just the years behind bars. It was the memory of the life he had stolen. And every day, he would have to relive it. His cell was small, cold, and sterile. The walls were bare except for the occasional peeling paint and a single metal bed that was more of a cot than anything else. His days blurred together. He would wake up early, do his mandatory chores, and then return to his cell, where he would be left alone to stare at the walls. The other prisoners, some of whom had committed far worse crimes than his, gave him a wide berth. They could see the guilt in his eyes. He was a murderer, after all, and in their eyes, he wasn't even a person anymore. He was a shadow, a ghost, someone who no longer had a place in the world outside the prison walls. David tried to keep his head down, tried to avoid confrontation. He spent hours reading, trying to lose himself in books, in stories that took him far away from the bleakness of his reality. But no matter how many pages he turned, no matter how many books he read, the gnawing emptiness in his chest never went away. He had killed a man. He had shattered lives, and now he was paying the price. Months passed, and David's life in prison became a monotonous routine. He woke up, worked, ate, and then returned to his cell to sit in silence. He had tried to make amends in the only way he could, through letters. He wrote to his mother, though he never expected a response. He wrote to anyone who would listen, offering his apologies, his remorse, even though he knew that nothing would ever be enough. One day, as he sat on his cot reading a book, a guard came to his cell and told him he had a visitor. For a moment, David's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? He hadn't heard from anyone in months, not since his mother's last letter, which was short and distant. With a deep breath, he followed the guard down the cold corridors to the visiting area. There, waiting for him, was someone he had not expected to see, a young woman dressed in business attire standing at the other side of the thick glass window. She looked out of place in the prison, her expression calm but determined. David's mind raced as he tried to place her. "David Monroe?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, that's me," he replied, his voice barely audible. "My name is Rachel. I'm a journalist. I've been following your case for some time now." David's heart sank. He knew what this meant. She was here to write about him, to make a story out of his tragedy. But as Rachel continued to speak, her words surprised him. "I've been following your story for a while, and I believe there's more to it than what's been reported. You've been labeled as a murderer, but I think there's more to your actions than anyone realizes. I want to give you a chance to tell your side of the story." David blinked, unsure of what to say. A chance to tell his side of the story? He had already confessed, already pleaded guilty. There was no defending what he had done. But Rachel wasn't offering him an escape. She wasn't offering him freedom. She was offering him something far more meaningful. She was offering him a chance to confront his past, to share his story, and maybe, just maybe, make some small difference in the lives of others. Rachel's words were a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in a world that had become dark and empty. It was the first time in a long time that someone had looked at him and seen more than just a murderer. Maybe, just maybe, this could be his chance to find some redemption, even if it was only through the truth. As the guard called time, signaling the end of the visit, Rachel smiled at him. "I'll be back," she said. "We'll talk again." David watched her leave, feeling something inside him stir. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, he felt like he might have a purpose again. The journey toward redemption wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, it was a journey worth taking. David didn't know what to expect next, but he was determined to face the consequences of his actions. Rachel's visit had sparked something in him, a desire to not just sit idly by and accept his fate, but to try and do something meaningful, even in prison. He didn't know where it would lead, but he was willing to try. The days stretched on, but with each day, David began to see the world in a different light. He had taken a life, but now, in a small way, he was beginning to take control of his own life again, not as a man condemned by his past, but as someone who could still find a way to make things right, and maybe, just maybe, he could find peace. David spent the next few months in a haze of introspection, trying to reconcile the person he had been with the one he was becoming. Rachel's visits became more frequent, and with each one, he opened up a little more. sharing pieces of his story that had once been buried deep inside. He had come to realize that the guilt he carried wasn't just about the life he had taken. It was about the man he had been before the crime, the man who had allowed himself to spiral so far into darkness. But with every revelation, there was a creeping unease. There was a nagging feeling at the back of his mind, a whisper that perhaps Rachel wasn't just a journalist, perhaps she was after something more than just a story. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session where he had confessed the full extent of his guilt, David received a strange letter. It was from his lawyer, and it was marked with an urgent note. "Read immediately." He tore open the envelope, his heart pounding, wondering what news could have possibly arrived now, after everything had been settled. The letter was brief. "David, I have just been made aware of new evidence in your case. You were wrongfully convicted. There are inconsistencies in the case files that we need to discuss. You've been a victim of a setup. Call me when you get this." David felt the blood drain from his face. He had been wrongfully convicted. It couldn't be true. He had confessed, hadn't he? There was no mistake. There was no way he had been set up. Or was there? His mind spun in 1,000 directions. What if the confession was coerced? What if he had been manipulated into taking the fall for someone else's crime? But that didn't make sense. He had known what he did. He had killed a man. Or had he? The doubt started to creep in like a slow poison, filling his every thought. He needed answers, but he couldn't trust anyone anymore. Not his lawyer. Not even Rachel. A week later, Rachel showed up at the prison again. She looked unusually tense, and as soon as David saw her, he could tell something was off. Her usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced with a nervous energy that she couldn't quite hide. "I need to talk to you, David," she said quickly, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be watching. David's stomach twisted. "What's going on?" Rachel leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been digging into your case. I didn't just want to write about it. I wanted to understand it. And what I found, David, I think you were framed. I think someone set you up." David's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced as she continued. Everything you've told me fits the narrative of a carefully constructed plan. Your confession, it was too easy, too quick. The evidence, it doesn't add up. Someone used you to cover their tracks. You didn't kill that man, David. Not the way they said you did. David's heart hammered in his chest. It couldn't be true. It couldn't. But as Rachel spoke, she made it seem so real. The feeling that had been gnawing at him, the nagging suspicion, now had weight behind it. A real possibility. "But why?" David whispered, his voice shaking. "Why would someone do this to me? Why would I confess to something I didn't do?" Rachel hesitated, as if weighing the words carefully before speaking them. "I don't know. But there's one thing I've learned. Everyone has something to hide. And the man you killed, well, he wasn't who they said he was." David's mind raced faster. Could it be true? Could he have been manipulated into taking the fall for someone else's crime? Was he a pawn in a larger game? But if he hadn't killed that man, then who had? And why had his own confession felt so real to him? Rachel continued, "I've been trying to dig deeper into the case, David, but I'm getting close to something big. Someone is watching me. Someone doesn't want the truth to come out. Be careful." Her warning sent a chill down David's spine. What had he gotten himself into? Had Rachel known more about his case than she had let on from the very beginning? She leaned back in her chair, her eyes dark with concern. "We need to move quickly. I can't do this alone, David. I need you to trust me." But David's trust was fraying. The pieces didn't fit anymore. Rachel's insistence that he had been set up made him question everything, but it also raised more questions. Who had set him up? Why? And most importantly, had he truly committed the crime, or had he been tricked into believing he had? "I need more answers," David said, his voice barely audible. Rachel nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on him. "We'll get them. But we need to be careful. There are people involved in this who will stop at nothing to keep the truth from coming out." David stood up from the table, his mind in turmoil. He couldn't stay in prison forever. If he was truly innocent, he had to find a way out. But trusting Rachel, someone who had been a stranger just months ago, was a dangerous game. Could he trust her? Or was she playing him just like everyone else had? As Rachel walked away, leaving David alone with his thoughts, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. Should he continue down this path of uncertainty, chasing the truth at all costs? Or had he already made the biggest mistake of his life by starting to doubt the reality of his confession? The prison walls seemed to close in around him. Time was running out, and the truth, whatever it was slipping further and further from his grasp. But one thing was certain. This was far from over. David Monroe had confessed to a murder, but now the question wasn't whether he was guilty. It was who had truly committed the crime, and as he sat alone in his cell, the answer seemed just out of reach, waiting for the next twist in the story to reveal itself. But one thing was clear. Someone was playing a game with him, and in this game, nothing was as it seemed. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Even as Rachel's words echoed in his mind, the uncertainty continued to build. He had been living a lie for so long, but now it seemed like the entire foundation of his life was beginning to crumble. What if everything he thought he knew was wrong? Days passed in the sterile monotony of prison life. Each moment felt like an eternity as David wrestled with the reality of his situation. The constant doubts clawed at him. Had he been manipulated into confessing? Had Rachel, the one person who seemed to care, played a part in all of this? He was pulled from his thoughts when a guard approached his cell one afternoon. "Monroe, you've got a visitor," the guard announced, his tone flat. David's heart skipped a beat. Could it be Rachel? Or had his lawyer finally figured out the truth? He stood up, his mind racing with possibilities, as the guard led him down the narrow hallway toward the visitor's room. When he entered the room, he saw a familiar face, his lawyer, but there was something off about the way he was sitting. His usual confident demeanor was replaced with something more uncertain. The lawyer's eyes were darting around the room nervously, and David felt a surge of anxiety. Something was wrong. David sat across from him. "What's going on? You said there was new evidence." The lawyer hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice low. "David, I've been looking into your case, and I've found something I wasn't expecting." David leaned forward, the anxiety rising in his chest. "What is it?" The lawyer paused, his hands shaking slightly as he slid a file across the table. "There's a new witness, someone who claims to have seen you that night. But it's not what you think. This witness, he says you weren't the one who did it. He says you weren't even in the area that night." David's mind reeled. "What? How could—" The lawyer raised his hand, cutting him off. "It's not that simple, David. The witness doesn't just claim that you weren't there. He says you were framed. And the person who framed you, well, it's someone close to you. Someone you trust." David felt the blood drain from his face. The words didn't make sense. Who could have framed him? The only people he had trusted were Rachel and his lawyer, both of whom had seemed so earnest. But could either of them be involved in this twisted game? David opened the file, his hands trembling as he read through the documents. The witness's statement was chilling. The details about that night, the robbery, the murder, it all pointed to one person, a person he never would have suspected. And the worst part? The witness claimed that this person had been feeding David information all along. "This isn't real," David muttered, his voice shaking. "It can't be." The lawyer didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. "I wish I could say you're wrong, but I don't think you are. The problem is, David, the witness isn't just anyone. It's Rachel." David's stomach dropped. He felt like the room was spinning. "Rachel? Number. She's been helping me. She's the only one who's been on my side." The lawyer shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know how it happened, but the pieces fit too perfectly. She's been feeding you information from the inside, David. She's been manipulating you, guiding you to believe things that weren't true. She's been playing you all along." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. Rachel, the woman who had come to him so earnestly, the one who had promised to help him uncover the truth, she had been using him all this time. The betrayal stung worse than anything he had ever felt. But why? Why would she do this? David whispered, his voice breaking. The lawyer leaned forward, his eyes serious. That's what we need to figure out, and we don't have much time. I'm telling you this now because I've been looking into it, and I think she's going to do something soon. I don't know what exactly, but I can feel it. David stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth. His mind was a whirlwind. Rachel had been playing him the entire time. He couldn't fathom why. Why use him like this? What could she possibly have gained? Was she just after a story? Or was there something deeper at play? I have to talk to her, David said, his voice cold with determination. The lawyer grabbed his arm, stopping him. Don't, David. Not yet. You need to be careful. If she really is involved in this, confronting her could make things worse. We need to gather more evidence, understand why she's been doing this, and what she wants from you. David jerked his arm free, his anger boiling over. I've trusted her. She lied to me, manipulated me. I deserve to know the truth. The lawyer's face softened. I understand. But rushing in blindly is a mistake. If we want to expose her, we need to do it smart. We need proof. And we need to be prepared for anything. David took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside of him. He had to think clearly. There had to be something else. Some clue, some piece of evidence that would prove Rachel's involvement. But what if it was too late? What if Rachel already knew what David was planning? As the days passed, David's mind became consumed with the possibility of confronting Rachel. He played out different scenarios in his head, trying to anticipate her reaction, wondering if she would break or deny everything. Finally, the day came. Rachel was scheduled to visit him again. This time, David was prepared. He would get the answers he needed, one way or another. When she entered the room, he was sitting in the corner, his face a mask of calm. Rachel smiled at him, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something different about her today. She seemed distant, colder than before. David, how are you? She asked, sitting down across from him. David didn't respond at first. He just stared at her, his eyes searching, trying to find any hint of guilt. I need you to tell me the truth, Rachel, he said, his voice steady. Everything, all of it. Her smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. What do you mean? David stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. I know about the witness. I know what you've been doing. You've been manipulating me, guiding me to believe lies. Why? What's your game? Rachel's face hardened, but there was no surprise in her expression. She had known this confrontation was coming. You don't understand, David, she said, her voice low and calculating. I never wanted it to come to this, but now you've figured it out, haven't you? David's heart pounded in his chest. What does that mean? What have you been doing? Rachel stood up, her posture now defensive. I had no choice. You were always going to be the fall guy. You were perfect for it. You were the perfect scapegoat. David's mind raced. What are you talking about? Who was behind this? Rachel's lips curled into a cold smile. I'll tell you everything, David. But first, you need to understand, you were never supposed to get out of here. I was just the first step in your downfall. The truth hit David like a punch to the gut. His entire life, the pain, the guilt, the prison sentence, it had all been orchestrated. And now, the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. But just as he stepped forward, ready to confront her fully, the door to the room burst open. The lawyer appeared in the doorway, his face pale. David, he said urgently, we have to go. Now. David's heart skipped a beat as Rachel's face turned to stone. Something was very wrong. But before David could react, everything went black. David awoke to darkness, his head pounding. His body felt heavy, as though it were weighed down by chains. His eyes fluttered open, but there was nothing but blackness around him. Panic surged through him, and he struggled to sit up. Where was he? What had just happened? A faint light flickered on in the distance, and he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking toward him. His breath quickened, and he tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey. His mind raced with thoughts of Rachel, his lawyer, the trap that was closing in around him. Suddenly, the dim light intensified, and David saw two shadowy figures in front of him. His heart stopped. "Rachel?" His voice was hoarse, disoriented. The figures stepped into the light, and David's breath caught in his throat. It was Rachel. No, not just Rachel. The lawyer stood beside her, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You?" David whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "You were in on it. You. Both of you." Rachel's smile was icy, her eyes cold. "It was never about you, David. You were just the pawn in a much bigger game." David felt the ground beneath him shift as his world started to crumble. He had been played. His trust in Rachel, his trust in his lawyer, it had all been part of the plan. He had been so certain, so desperate to believe that Rachel was on his side, that he had failed to see the truth. But the truth wasn't just about betrayal. It was something far more horrifying. Rachel stepped forward, her face close to his now. "You've been a great distraction. Your case, your story, it drew attention away from what we were really doing." David's mind spun as he processed her words. "What are you talking about? What's the real plan?" The lawyer, still standing behind Rachel, chuckled darkly. "The real plan was never about you getting out of prison. It was about who would benefit from your conviction." Rachel nodded. "All the work we did, David, all the information we fed you, it was to get you convicted, to keep you in here. We needed to make sure that you stayed quiet, that no one would suspect what we were really up to." David felt his stomach turn. He was starting to understand, but it didn't make sense. Why? Why do this to me? The lawyer stepped forward, his expression twisted in satisfaction. "Because, David, you were always the perfect fall guy, the perfect scapegoat. But the bigger picture? The bigger picture was always the money." Rachel smiled cruelly, and David's blood ran cold as she revealed the truth. "It wasn't just about your case, David," she said softly. "It was about manipulating people, creating distractions, controlling the flow of information. We planted ourselves in your life to make sure no one ever looked in the right direction." David's mind raced, and his pulse quickened as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. You've been using me. But why? Who else is involved in this?" The lawyer's grin widened. "Everyone, David. Everyone's involved. You never stood a chance. The system was rigged from the start. It was all about the money, and now it's too late." Rachel gave a mocking smile. "We didn't need you anymore, David. The plan is already in motion. You were just the distraction, the decoy." David's blood ran cold as the realization hit him like a thunderclap. He wasn't just a victim of a cruel game. He was the key to something far darker, a conspiracy so vast and far-reaching that it had manipulated the very system he had trusted. And now, they were discarding him, leaving him in the dark with no way to stop them. "Why now?" David rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why tell me all of this now?" Rachel's eyes glinted with malice. "Because there's nothing left for you to do, David. You've lost. We've already won." David's head spun as he tried to process what they were saying, but one thing was clear. They had been working together all along, orchestrating his downfall, and now, with everything in place, they no longer needed him. But just as the weight of his realization hit him, something unexpected happened. The lawyer's expression faltered. For a brief second, his mask of confidence slipped. David caught the glimpse of doubt in his eyes. For the first time in the conversation, the lawyer seemed uneasy. Before David could react, the lawyer's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and cursed under his breath. "Something's wrong," he muttered, his voice tense. "We need to go. Now." Rachel's face tightened. Number not yet. He needs to be dealt with. David could feel the shift in the air, the sudden tension between them. Something was happening, something that was unraveling faster than they had planned. "Rachel," the lawyer snapped, his voice urgent, "we need to leave. It's too risky. You know it. David's confusion deepened. What was going on? Was there more to this story than even Rachel and the lawyer had anticipated? Something had shifted, something David didn't fully understand. Rachel's eyes flashed with frustration, but she stepped back. Fine, we leave now. But this isn't over. The lawyer nodded, pulling out a set of keys and unlocking the door behind him. We need to move fast. The plan is still in motion, but we need to adjust. We need to make sure everything goes according to plan. As Rachel and the lawyer turned to leave, David's mind raced. His body felt weak. His mind was clouded by the shock of the truth. But something in him refused to accept this as his end. He had been used, betrayed. But now, he was more determined than ever. There was still something he could do. Before they could leave the room, David bolted to his feet, his legs finally obeying him. He lunged toward the lawyer, grabbing him by the arm. "You're not getting away," David growled. The lawyer turned, his eyes wide with sudden panic. "What are you doing?" David felt the surge of adrenaline rush through him. "I won't let you win. I won't let you destroy everything." Rachel's voice cut through the air. "You're too late, David. It's already over." But as David and the lawyer struggled, a sudden, loud crash reverberated through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, many of them, heavy and determined. Rachel froze, her face paling. "They're here," the lawyer whispered, his voice shaking. David's heart raced. He turned, half expecting the worst. Guards, more traps, a last-ditch effort to silence him. But the figure who appeared in the doorway was not who he expected. A man in a dark suit stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. Behind him, a team of armed men stood at attention. "Who the hell are you?" Rachel demanded, her voice sharp with defiance. The man in the suit didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a badge. "FBI," he said, his tone cold. "You're all under arrest." David blinked in confusion, the world spinning around him. It wasn't just a betrayal anymore. The real game had just begun. As the FBI agents moved in, cuffing Rachel and the lawyer, David's mind raced to understand the full scope of the betrayal. But one thing was clear. He had been saved at the last possible moment, pulled from the jaws of a conspiracy he hadn't fully understood. He stood there, stunned, watching as the agents led Rachel and the lawyer away. "David Monroe?" one of the agents asked, turning toward him. David nodded slowly, his mind still reeling. "Yeah." The agent gave him a grim smile. "We've been watching them for months, and it looks like you've been caught in the middle of something much bigger than you thought." David felt his heart race, his hands trembling. The story was far from over. In that moment, he realized one thing. The truth was more dangerous than he ever could have imagined. And now, the real battle for his freedom had only just begun.